Hi, my name is Lucas, and I'm going to be talking about queer theory today. So, just so I can go ahead and preface everything, I just want to say that I am going to sound a little bit scrambled at first, and it's going to kind of sound like, what the hell are you talking about? This makes no sense. But hopefully, the more I go into the topic and the more I develop the conversation, you'll be able to kind of understand where I'm coming from. On top of that, this might sound a little bit unfinished. And the reason behind that is not because it is unfinished, but because I'm actually trying to create something that is vague enough for you, my listener, my watcher, to be able to put together your own ideas with this and kind of develop something that you can not only, you know, use for yourself, but also use when talking to your parents and talking to your friends and family members, just so you can really take this and communicate with them. That's kind of why I'm doing this for myself too, and why I'm so passionate about this. I remember being a kid and my parents always asking me why I was so interested in this. And when I say a kid, I do mean like 15, 16. Um, but I I kind of put this together because I wanted to create a narrative that you and that I can use whenever I want to talk about this and kind of be able to justify um, why I think it is important. Not because I don't think it is important, but because I think that sometimes people forget why it is important. So, in talking about the definition of queer, um, I found this one on a dictionary, and I'm kind of not pleased by it. So, it says an approach to literary and cultural study that rejects traditional categories of gender and sexuality. And kind of where my problem lies with this is that this is just not this is just too vague. This is not real enough and it's not honest enough when it comes to what it's all about. When we talk about queer theory, we're not just talking about queerness. We're talking about LGBTQ plus issues. We're talking about feminism. We're talking about people of color. This is really something that goes further than just sexuality and gender. This is something that uh, really embodies what the idea of intersectionality is. So while I'm not really able to rewrite the definition of queer theory, I am able to kind of dissect it, and that's what I want to do today. Um, so first, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about LGBTQ history, and then I'm going to talk about kind of what is going on now in the community, kind of talk about the present and where we stand as a community. And then I also want to talk about what queer theory really is based on, which is personal identity, language, the concept of queer time, and also power relations and the relation to queerness. So I want to take all these kind of regular academic topics and really apply a queer perspective to them and try to use this as kind of the foundation to what queer theory is, to me at the very least, and how I can use this to um, kind of create a narrative that I feel comfortable with. So let's go ahead and start with history. So starting with the history, I wanted to talk about Achilles and Sappho because these are actually two very interesting characters when it comes to LGBTQ plus history. So Achilles, we all know him for the Achilles tendon, etc., etc. But the reason why I put him in here is because he actually had a male lover that he publicly said that his relationship with him was better than any man could ever have with his wife. So pretty clear his feelings towards him. And then we also have Sappho, who uh, was a poet that got exiled into the island of Lesbos, which is where the word lesbian comes from, and the word sapphic as well. So sapphic refers to uh, kind of women loving women interests. And we also have that word for it for men, which is like men loving men interests, which would be Achillean. So that's kind of interesting for me. Um, so throughout most of history, the idea of queerness was depicted in books and it was depicted in paintings. There's actually paintings of both of these characters and both of these people on display in a lot of museums and also online of them with same-sex partners. So I think really important just to remember that, first of all. And also, kind of just realize where the shift began. So during the Victorian era, there was a development of prude sexual values, and this kind of just like gave this idea that sex is only really meant for marriage, and this created a stigma relating to homosexuality. Um, the best way that I can describe this is that homosexuality kind of like gained this reputation the way that premarital sex did. So it began as kind of uh, an excuse that people used to kind of just put together in a sense that like they used to say, like the devil told me to do so, or she's a witch, she's this, she's that, she's taking advantage of her sexuality to abuse her power, et cetera, which just suddenly led to women who had sex before marriage being considered crazy, and um, so there was prostitution that became illegal at this point. Kind of just you started to see kind of like where all these ideas that led to the criminalization of and medicalization of homosexuality just kind of start to develop when you realize that premarital sex and homosexuality had the pretty much like the same ideas attached to it just because of these new changes and sexual values. So next we have Havelock Ellis. And Havelock Ellis was a researcher that believed that homosexuality was not a choice and that it should not be considered a disease. And this was, of course, now this sounds very, okay, we all agree. We're on the same page on that. But at the same time, this is a time where people were still following Victorian era principles. So most gay men and most lesbian women were actually in jail. They were imprisoned or taken into mental hospitals just to treat their homosexuality, depending on where they were in like their location. So certain parts had it just completely illegal, and some other parts had it as a mental disorder. So he kind of did something very, very different for his time, which was that instead of interviewing these prisoners and mental institution patients, he decided to go for healthy gay men. So he wasn't talking to just random uh, people that were put together and kind of beat up by the system at this point, but he was talking to people who were in the streets and living regular lives, regardless of what the government or the DSM was saying about their sexuality. And he was also one of the first few people to kind of acknowledge transgender people in his writings. And then he also talked about how transgender and homosexual individuals were an anomaly, which means that, it's nothing rare. We're actually all over the place. You just haven't seen us, kind of. So I think that was very interesting. So as one thing leads to another, thanks to works like those of Ellis, we started to see how the word homosexual and homoerotic and words like that kind of just began to be taken out of the DSM. The DSM is a dictionary of medical disorders that's really used to kind of like diagnose patients, but we started to see kind of like those changes, and as that started to happen, we started to see kind of queer inclusive spaces, but they were by queer people for queer people. Um, an example of this would be Stonewall, and this is kind of something that we all kind of know just based in our history, and the few facts that we can find kind of and have readily accessible to us. Um, we kind of started to see the development of the gay liberation movement. So next we have the AIDS epidemic, and at this point, this was during the 1980s, and it was right after the gay liberation movement started, right when we started to see actually any progress for the community. But it we also started to see kind of like the demise of kind of how society saw us. Um, a lot of religious groups were saying that AIDS was the gay cancer, which God had sent down in order to fix his mistake of creating homosexuality. Um, so you kind of start to see where this very homophobic behavior start to form. Um, and then we also kind of took it as an attack because the government did not mention this until it was a little too late, to be honest, to do anything. And we had already lost thousands and thousands of people before the president even acknowledged that this was happening. So we can kind of just see how the queer community and the LGBTQ plus community was seen. And of course, after this, there was thankfully a recovery. There was enough time uh, between then and now to the point that we started to see a lot more positivity towards the LGBTQ plus community. People kind of started to really fight for themselves, and as a community, we started to fight for the recognition that we deserve and the equality that we deserve. And that kind of leads us to now, to the present. Um, and so when we talk about the present, we have to acknowledge that there's good and there's bad. Um, there's a lot of good, of course, but there's a lot more bad. And in this project, I'm really trying to stay positive, but as you'll see, when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community, we can't really point fingers towards somewhere else and say that is where the problem lies. We also have issues within our community. We have things that we need to address in order to create the safe space that our community should be. So let's talk about the good first, right? So we have a lot more LGBTQ plus people now than we did before. And that might sound a little crazy, but it's true. We actually have seen people who identify as LGBTQ plus rising throughout the last few years. Down here, I have an article by the Gallup in which they are talking about how it went up to 5.6% from last year. I think it was at, I think 2019 actually, it was at 4.3, and then after before that in 2017 it was at 3.6 or something along those numbers. So we're definitely seeing an increase in people who can identify. So that kind of just means that more people are becoming accepting of the idea of being LGBTQ plus, and beyond that, people are also kind of, the LGBTQ community itself is kind of just taking a step back and reevaluating what it considers a part of the community. So that's really great news for us, and kind of just people who identify as something that's non-heteronormative. Um, and then the next point is that there is more representation on the media. And so here I included four TV programs slash movies that are actually very interesting and very LGBTQ friendly. So when we look at the very top one right here, but I'm a cheerleader. It's a really great and funny movie. I definitely recommend it. It's very campy. Um, there's a lot of like contrasting colors, and it's like all pink and all blue, and kind of really it does a really great job at at telling a story about being gay. I definitely recommend this movie. We also have Call Me by Your Name, and I am not going to lie, I have not seen that movie. I cannot recommend it. Sorry. But I do recommend Moonlight. So Moonlight is actually um, a very big deal for us, mainly because it was the first movie with an LGBTQ plus storyline with people of color as well to have won an Academy Award, which is really amazing and really great. Uh, a really great demonstration of how uh, big, uh, big, big identities like the Academy are kind of switching their views to something more LGBTQ plus inclusive. But the one show that I really 110% recommend to everybody is the show Pose by Ryan Murphy. This show is takes place during the 19 I think it was 1950s, 1960s, around that time period, and we start to see kind of black trans women telling their side of the story of the LGBTQ gay liberation movement. So it's very interesting, it's very raw, and it's very uh, true and very honest. And it really just shows you kind of like the other side of the coin from what we usually get told on history books, which is a very heteronormative and uh, positive history of kind of started with nothing and suddenly became, equal. So it's very interesting. It's really great to watch that show. 110% recommend. So now we're gonna start talking about the bad stuff. So it's gonna kind of get a little bit sad for a minute, but hopefully it will stay interesting enough, I believe. So up here in this corner, we have a character from Modern Family, and he is very well known to be married to another man. And in the show, they're very happy, very excited, and everything. And the problem kind of just lies in the fact that he is actually a straight man, playing a gay character. I'll explain more about that in a minute, but it kind of really shows you um, what is right and what is wrong with uh, with Hollywood right now and LGBTQ representation. Beyond that, we also have right here Max. He is from the L Word. I do know his name. I'm not really sure why, but he actually plays a trans character in a show about lesbians. And throughout the entire show, he pretty much gets trash talked and put down for leaving his kind and leaving women. And he is considered a loss to the lesbian community. Just kind of very transphobic behaviors towards him. And to make it even worse, they also depict him as very, very violent and very aggressive just for being a trans man. And down here, we have my favorite. This one's about Stonewall, the movie. So there we see a conventionally attractive white male playing the role of the first person to stand up against the police during Stonewall riots. And if you know anything about the Stonewall riots, it is quite the opposite of what happened, but there's more to it in a minute. We'll talk about it in a sec. So, what's wrong with the media representation of the LGBTQ community? Well, first of all, lesbians are usually played in order to create this kind of like sexual desire for straight men. Um, Gay men are usually used as kind of like this comedic relief character that's really just meant to be there in order to create um, kind of like an uplifting mood after something tragic happens, or to be the one that's there to help the girl after the breakup, but never really to have storylines for themselves. We also have trans people that are usually played as criminals on TV shows, and they're either played as sex workers, they're played as murderers, they're played as violent people, the way that Max was, and they're also played kind of just as deceivers and liars because of their gender and being transgender. And then we also have bisexuality kind of just used as a uh, comfort zone where people can kind of be like, oh, yeah, we're so progressive. We included a bisexual character. But just like in every other movie you have ever seen, they will end up with somebody of the opposite sex. And kind of we start to see where the problem is really uh, being written onto movies here. Um, and beyond that, also with the casting. So majority of these roles are played by straight cisgendered actors and actresses. A lot of the cases that I can think of like these are like Jared Leto. We also have Scarlett Johansson. We have a lot of actors and actresses that have been casted to play queer roles that do not fit the description of a queer person, which LGBTQ artists, activists, and also actors and actresses have been arguing is not only critical to the misrepresentation that the community has, but it's also stealing roles from the LGBTQ community who could take those roles and could create a real experience and something like the queer struggle that a straight actor or actress could not understand. Um, it also creates like this opposing duality in which a straight actor can play a gay role, but a gay actor cannot play a straight role. In other words, like queerness can be played and dressed up and put on, but heterosexuality is too complex, and you can't do that because you won't be convincing as a queer person. Um, we also have trans and bisexual erasure. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. Um, so here we have bisexual erasure first. I'm going to talk about that for a second. So up top, I have two pictures. I have Lady Gaga. Let's see if it makes me. There we go. Lady Gaga. And we also have Ezra Miller. These two people are very out about their sexuality. They're both bisexual. They both consider themselves to be bisexual. And what we see a lot in within the community is the erasure of these sexualities, and both Ezra and Lady Gaga are played as either homosexual or heterosexual. In Ezra's point, he is usually just seen as a gay man, and Lady Gaga is usually just considered a straight woman. This is done by non-LGBTQ plus individuals and by LGBTQ plus individuals. And we kind of just start to see this erasure take place there and kind of invalidate some of the members in our community, and that's just where you start to see a bit of a problem. And this kind of just also transfers to by erasure. So, if you remember earlier, I said that on Stonewall, the movie, they portrayed the very first person to stand up to the police to be a white man who was conventionally attractive. The truth is, it is these two women right here, which are Marsha P. Johnson and also Sylvia, who ended up being the first ones to really take a step and start the Stonewall riots and start taking a step towards uh, the gay liberation movement. So it kind of just makes no sense for us to see this movie played by a white man when it should be two trans women, a Hispanic and a black trans woman, playing the roles of black and Hispanic trans women. This erasure is kind of just really making the situation worse and kind of creating this false narrative. And I remember I read an article about that in which the director said that the reason that he did that is because all stories are ultimately white stories, which is inherently racist. So there's that there's that bit of problem. Um, so the issue with these two types of erasure is that when it comes to transgender erasure, uh, there's different ways to do so. You can misgender somebody on purpose. You can just refuse to talk about their pronouns and address them with the correct pronouns. There's also erasure from history and culture. Like I said, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia were erased from our history just because they wanted to create a narrative that was uh, gonna keep those two groups, which are people of color and trans people, out of history books and out of our minds, just to continuously create this narrative that white gay men have done all the hard work in the community. Um, Another word is kind of excusing and participating in transphobia is a part of trans erasure. So if you have a friend that says transphobic comments and you say, that's fine, I have no problem here, or you'd laugh about it and you joke about it too, you are participating in trans erasure and transphobia and erasing something that is a part of our community. Beyond that, there's also acting as if trans issues and are not LGBTQ plus issues. Right now, something that's really, really big is trans athletes on sports and also on trans people using restrooms. So we see a lot of arguments there. And if we're going to sit here and say that trans issues are not our issues, then we should stop taking what happened at Stonewall and kind of all of the big gay liberation movements uh, events and take those and give them into a trans movement and take that away from us, because taking away from them uh, the importance is kind of just as bad as ultimately killing that entire group. Um, it creates a very hostile environment and it creates a very negative mentality and a very sense of a real sense of not belonging, and it just worsens the situation. When it comes to bisexuality, denying the existence of bisexuality, or calling it a phase, or just mislabeling somebody by saying they're fully straight or fully gay, all of those are just acts of blatant biphobia. So, what this means is that you are ultimately doing the exact same thing as a queer person to, as say, a gay man or a lesbian woman, you are doing the exact same thing to a bisexual person than a straight person does to you. And there's a lot of hypocrisy on that, and we should really if that is how people feel about certain things, then there's definitely a need to look into our story once again and look into our history once again and kind of just revisit everything. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about when it comes to what's bad in the LGBTQ plus community, it's going to be toxicity. And what I mean specifically by toxicity is going to be these four topics. There's sexism, racism, internalized homophobia, and the oversexualization of the LGBTQ plus community. When I'm talking about internalized homophobia, we see it a lot, specifically from men and lesbian women who kind of fit the heteronormative expectation. What this means is kind of like those gay guys that are masked for mask, which means that they're only looking for people who are straight passing, or women who say that butch women are not considered real women and are just trying to be men, and kind of misgender them on that sense, and kind of say that whole thing of I date women because I like women, I wouldn't date you because you look like a man, because you're butch. That is kind of where that homophobia is. When it comes to racism, I've talked about it already, and I'll talk about it again. Erasure of people of color, erasure of trans people of color from our history is not anything new. And beyond that, people now are disguising those things as preferences and saying that they just would not date an Asian man or a black woman or any type of person or race just because they are not what fits their description. That is ultimately Eurocentric and racist. Um, when it comes to sexism, we also have the issue that that kind of we see a lot, specifically from gay men, where they kind of start to act like disgusted by the female anatomy and kind of just start putting down female bodies and pushing them away as much as possible just because they're not sexually attracted to them. That is ultimately dismissing a woman because they serve no sexual value to you, which is pretty much the exact same thing that straight men do to women throughout most of history that has led to all of the sexist issues and problems that we have now. Um, and beyond that, when we talk about the over sexualization of the LGBTQ plus community, this is very, very much a personal issue that everybody goes through. So there is a certain amount of the LGBTQ plus community that has a very negative relationship with sex because of everything that has been done through the LGBTQ community. This idea of hookup culture being normal, of cruising, and kind of like the importance of being of sexual value to another being, and only really mattering if you are attractive to another man or another woman, kind of really breaks down the mental health of the LGBTQ plus community, which kind of begins to really describe why the LGBTQ community has such high numbers of not only depression, but also anxiety, body dysmorphia, and suicide attempts. When we start looking at all that stuff, there's so much hatred within the community that the community itself cannot handle the amount um, of violence that we are creating towards each other.
So now you might be wondering, what does all of this information have to do with queer theory? Why are we sitting here and trash talking the queer community? Why are we sitting here and talking about history and talking about Victorian eras and research and conversion therapy and all of these really fun topics? Well, that is the queer experience, and that is where the queer theory comes from. So now we're talking about queer theory. So finally, we're reaching the point where we're going to start talking about things that are um, more about reading and more about actual textual evidence that kind of supports the idea of queer theory even existing and even mattering and having any sort of value and importance. First, we're going to start talking about our personal identities, and we're going to talk about this in kind of a perspective that is very well known at this point about personal identity through John Locke. And then we're also going to follow that with language. So when I'm talking about language, what I mean is kind of like how we communicate between LGBTQ plus people and why language matters so much to us the way that it does compared to that of straight people. And then we're also going to be talking about queer time. So queer time is a very specific experience that only queer people have. Straight people cannot have this experience. And so the reason why this is so important is because this shapes us as identities and as our views of ourselves. So we'll talk about that for a minute and just kind of really look into it. And then we're going to kind of just connect all of this and talk about power relations and how they affect the queer community as a whole. So starting with personal identities. So jumping straight into Locke right now, in an essay concerning human understanding, he makes the following comment about personal identity. To find wherein personal identity consists, we must consider what person stands for. I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking, and as it seems to be essential to it, it is impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. So when it comes to consciousness, Locke says that this is how we regard the self. So he says, self is that conscious thinking thing, whether substance made up, whether spiritual, material, simple, or compounded, it matters not, which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness and misery, and so is concerned, so itself as far as the consciousness extends. And so what this kind of means to me, and what I am able to understand, taking that whole idea of pleasure and pain and capable of happiness and misery, as a community, the LGBTQ plus people have had trauma. But at the same time, we know a joy that straight people will never understand, which is that joy of coming out and actually finally figuring yourself out to that degree. And I think that is our own real way of pleasure and pain. And of course, there's a lot more examples and a lot more experiences like this, but it's just one that really sets in the idea that there is, a pleasure, a pain, a happiness, a misery that we as queer people face. So whenever we want to ask the question, is there such a thing as queer consciousness? The answer just very obviously becomes yes. And now I'm going to talk about language and queer language specifically. So when it comes to language, it is very different for LGBTQ plus people than it is to a straight person. So Deborah Cameron and Don Kulik have this book called Language and Sexuality, where they introduce the 4 phases of research about gay and lesbian language, as they call them. And they divide these periods into, they divide like a timeline into different periods, and they talk about the 1920s to the 1940s, 1950s to the 1960s, the 70s to the mid-90s, and then from there to the present. The first phase refers to homosexuality being considered a disease. The second one, it's more about the gay liberation movement. The third one is kind of like the aftermath of the gay liberation movement. And the fourth is now. So what the fourth one's really surrounding itself by is when queer linguistics began to focus in the materialization of language instead of a reflection of identity. So kind of like what this means is that the language that we use to communicate as queer people is crucial to our identity. It is a part of our identity, and it is only language that we understand. We understand the deepness of being gay, of being lesbian, of being bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, etc. Just by being able to experience this and having these queer consciousness, which have really only saved us from erasure the way that we have sadly done to transgender people and bisexual people throughout so much of our history. It is not only a way for us to express our ideas, but it's also a way that we create our own identity. And by creating this identity and understanding what this labels mean, we as queer people um, are able to experience ourselves fully, which is one of the struggles that straight people don't really understand from language. So the next topic is actually queer time. So the term queer time actually comes from Jack Halberstam's essay Queer Temporality and Postmodern Geographies in their book In a Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies and Subcultural Lives. So out of this entire paragraph that I have here, the thing that really matters and the part that is really important is this right here. So queer uses of time and space develop at least in part in opposition to the institutions of family, heterosexuality, and reproduction. So the reason that this matters is because we as people oppose these institutions that our lives are different than that of straight people. So let's take, for example, here, a straight timeline. First, they are born, and then they get a little bit older, time goes by. If they are boys, they start to like the color blue. If they are girls, they like the color pink. So we're going to use red here. So we have two completely different stories set up. And then, the boy kind of slowly but surely, becomes a kid, a teen. So does the girl. She starts having her period. She starts going through her body changes. The boy starts growing body hair. So does the girl. Not gonna lie. Body hair is normal. They hit their teens. They have the talk. They develop feelings for their first crushes. They tell about that crush to their family members, their friends. They get rejected. They experience heartbreak and shame. They fall in love, get married, have children, get older, retire, live in front of their White House with their picket fence, sitting down in their rocking chairs. That is what, life is for straight people. That is what they can aim for. But when it comes to a queer timeline, things are completely different. So we don't have a very set time. And this is not to say that we don't get old. We do. We age, we get wrinkled like everybody else. Nothing new there. But queer life is different. And it is because the timeline itself is non-traditional. What this means is that along with the life events that a straight person has, which are getting older, puberty, first crush, all of that stuff, queer people also have to go through the experience that are specific and individual to non-heteronormative individuals, like the search of our identities, gender expression, our attraction, coming out to ourselves, our family, our friends, losing family members, losing friendships because of an identity feature like our sexuality, or our identity itself. We realize that the talk that our parents gave us was not really meant for us. It was meant for your brother or sister who just so happened to be straight, not for you who is a queer or a gay straight, not gay straight, but a gay man or a lesbian woman, or a transgender person. You kind of start to realize that none of these things are going to be helpful for you. The first time that we feel unsafe in a situation, or the first time that we felt safe in our environment, in our identities, all these things are specific to the LGBTQ plus community. And the thing is that while, maybe somebody came out at this point of their lives, somebody else came out probably over here. Sometimes, here, we want to transition and become the gender that we identify with. Sometimes it is the opposite way, and it happens there. Sometimes it happens towards the last years of our lives. Sometimes it happens really young. Life does not have a specific timeline for these types of situations, and we can't really do anything about it except learn to live with it and cope with it, and just understand that we are going to go through life differently than straight people. Um, Aside from this, it is these experiences that are synonymous to queer time. So if queer time is synonymous to unique queer experiences, and queer experiences create a queer self, and that self creates a consciousness, that means that a queer consciousness and a queer self are both real and fully justifying the need for a queer theory and a queer thought. So again, why does any of this matter? I'm going in circles. It sounds like if I'm just saying new topics and never going back to it, right? Well, that's when we touch our last topic, which is going to be power relations. So when it comes to power relations, the best way to look at it would be Michel Foucault's The Subject and Power and Discipline and Punish. So in Subject and Power, he says that the production of knowledge is based on strategic scenarios based on power relations. This is to say that as a society, we participate in an exchange between two entities. One is the governor and the other the governed. This relationship, he said, is essential for communities, for those who possess the most knowledge are in the positions of power. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault brings the idea of the panopticon, which is a concept that gives the ability to the judge to be able to talk about, to be able to learn the subjects at a glance, creating all this knowledge for themselves. So this gives them a privilege of being able to generate this knowledge, which, as we established earlier, creates power. So therefore, the observer is able to create knowledge and is able to create more power. But then you wonder, how does this happen? Well, the subject is at a disadvantage. It creates a struggle against the government of individualization by applying themselves into immediate everyday life, tying the subject to their consciousness and self-knowledge, suggesting a form of power which subjugates. This is pretty much saying that the subject is made to believe that their individuality, whether it is what unites them to the community or what pushes them to feel a need to resist for the government entity, is created to occupy the mind of the subject, creating a distraction from them seeking power and ultimately depriving them from said power. So, how does this apply to queer theory? Queer oppression is formed by queering people. What this means is that we have to talk about LGBTQ plus history and the current state of the community, not only to create a timeline and to say this is what is going on in the community, but also to form this knowledge that we have in some sort of way been removed from. We are creating a knowledge to provide people a tool to fight the stigma that is created of the LGBTQ plus community that we were talking about earlier. So now I have reached the end of my presentation, and I just want to say thank you for sticking with me. It has been a very long presentation, I understand that, but these are topics that I really feel are very important, especially for myself as a queer person, and also to everybody who knows a queer person or understands the queer struggle or has been through this queer struggle with themselves. It is important to talk about ourselves and our community this way, because if we don't, nobody else will. If we don't talk about what is going on in our community and we don't talk about how these distinctive separations are really just methods of oppression from within the community and from the outside, we're unable to really form a community that can fight against what we need to fight against. We shouldn't be fighting each other. We shouldn't be worried about, mask for mask, or, if somebody's too butch or their pronouns. We should be worried about respecting each other and showing each other the compassion, the kindness, and the love that we all deserve from being human beings that have been through the same struggle and lived in very different timelines, but experience the queer timeline all at the same time. Thank you.